Let's begin here, because too many mistake silence for indifference. When a man ignores you, the first instinct is to take it personally, to wonder what changed, what went wrong, or what you did to deserve it. But the truth is often far less about you and far more about him. A woman who carries worth does not lose it in the space between messages. She does not shrink because someone has gone quiet. If anything, silence reveals what the connection was built on and what it was not. Because the man who vanishes without explanation is often trying to avoid something inside himself, not something in you. And when you stop chasing his attention, something begins to shift. He may not realize it yet, but that shift is where the story truly begins. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's take a deeper breath and step inside. Because to understand the weakness behind a man's silence, we have to understand the mask he wears and what that mask tries to hide. Carl Jung taught that whatever we avoid in ourselves, we often project onto others. In this case, a man who pulls away may not be strong. He may be protecting a very fragile self-image. He tells himself he needs space. What he often needs is control. And when faced with a woman who awakens something real in him, something vulnerable, his instinct might be to retreat. Why? Because real connection threatens the persona, the carefully shaped outer image, the one that says, "I'm fine on my own," the one that cannot admit fear or need or longing. And yet the unconscious doesn't go away. It speaks in discomfort, in silence, in the push-pull dynamic that leaves women guessing, waiting, and doubting themselves. But here's what most never see. When a woman keeps responding to his silence, with more effort, she strengthens his illusion of control. She teaches him that her worth is tied to his moods, and without realizing it, she becomes part of his inner conflict. But there is another path, one that begins not with confrontation, but with stillness, not with proving, but with remembering. The moment a woman stops asking, "What did I do wrong?" and begins asking, "What have I accepted that doesn't reflect my value?" is the moment she begins to individuate, to separate her true self from the shadow cast by his avoidance. This is not about playing games. It is not about silence for silence's sake. It is about alignment. Choosing to live in such a way that your worth is not dependent on anyone else seeing it first. And when you live like that, something remarkable happens. The man who once ignored you begins to feel what he cannot name, the loss of something he thought would always be there. And that's where this story really begins. Sometimes it begins subtly. A missed reply, a delayed response. The warmth that once felt effortless now feels calculated. And in that space between what was once clear and what is now uncertain, something begins to break. A woman who once felt seen begins to question her reflection, not because she has changed, but because the gaze that once affirmed her has turned away. This is the first wound. Not silence itself, but the meaning she assigns to it. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the outer world triggers an old imprint from within, a forgotten ache, a familiar uncertainty. And rather than facing it directly, she turns the blame inward. She begins to wonder what part of her is unworthy of presence. But this reaction does not come from the self. It comes from the persona, the mask built to earn love, to be pleasing, to be chosen. The mask tightens its grip when it feels abandoned. It whispers that if she were more or less or different, she would be loved again. What she does not yet see is that this moment, painful as it is, holds a hidden key. Because everything that shatters our certainty also reveals where it was placed. And if that certainty lived in someone else's attention, then its loss invites a deeper question: who taught her that she must be chosen to matter? The fracture deepens not when a man pulls away, but when a woman internalizes his absence as a mirror of her worth. The psyche, craving understanding, begins to make meaning where there is none. She analyzes, rewatches, rereads. The silence becomes a canvas for projection, and here the shadow begins to stir. Because Jung reminds us that the shadow is not only what we repress, it is also what we give away too freely. Our attention, our approval, our readiness to accept crumbs in the hope they will become a feast. These patterns are not new. They are ancient, often inherited. Many women were raised to believe that love must be earned through sacrifice. That being chosen is the proof of being good enough. So when that pattern is activated again, through one man's distance, the wound reopens and the script repeats. She may tell herself she is calm, but her body is restless. She may say she doesn't care, but her thoughts circle like vultures over a stillness she cannot explain. And yet what she truly seeks is not a message or a call. What she craves is validation that she is still lovable in the absence of approval. The deeper tragedy is not his silence. It is the way she learns to silence herself in response, to shrink her voice, her standards, her needs, just to remain within his orbit. This is the fracture beneath the fracture, the quiet betrayal of her own center. When the feminine becomes overattached to an unresponsive masculine, she abandons her own rhythm. Jung would say that this is the moment the self cries out beneath the persona, asking not to be loved, but to be remembered. To remember that her presence, her energy, her essence was never meant to be a bargaining chip. And yet here she is, waiting for a message, measuring her mood by his pattern of attention, feeling invisible even to herself. The unconscious seeks safety in the known, even if the known is neglect. Even if the pattern is painful, it is familiar. And so she clings to the hope that if she just waits, if she just tries harder, he will return, that the story will repair itself. But what if the fracture is not a sign of failure? What if it is a sign that the old way can no longer hold? When a man's attention fades and her sense of self crumbles with it, the psyche is not punishing her. It is waking her. Because anything that depends on another person's validation to exist is not the self. It is the echo of someone else's shaping. And it is in this echo that many women lose themselves. They become actresses in someone else's story, waiting in someone else's scene, hoping for a line that never comes. Jung said that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. And in these moments of emotional abandonment, fate is often a recycled wound, not destiny, but repetition. She may try to regain control by posting, reacting, reminding, but every move toward him pulls her further from herself. Because the pursuit of someone who is avoiding her is not love, it is survival. It is the child within still hoping to earn approval from a closed door. But this door will not open the way she hopes. Not because she's unworthy, but because it was never about her. His silence speaks of his own shadow, a fear of intimacy, of reflection, of being seen too clearly. And that fear masks itself as distance. So the fracture grows. But now she sees it. She can feel the sharpness of needing someone who does not show up. And in that pain, a quiet invitation begins to emerge. Not yet a solution, not yet peace, but an opening. The moment she realizes this ache is not new. It is old, and it did not begin with him. It began the first time she felt unseen and thought she deserved it. And so she stands at a threshold, not of fixing the relationship, but of facing the wound beneath it, of asking gently, "Where did I first learn that silence meant I was not enough?" That is the question the fracture brings. Not to be answered in haste, but held with patience. Because beneath every ignored message is a forgotten message from within one that says you were never meant to beg for what was always meant to be mutual. This is where individuation begins, in the stillness after the first break, not with noise, not with retaliation, but with a deeper listening. A listening that says, maybe this silence is here to show you your own voice. She begins to see it now. Not fully, not all at once, but like mist, clearing just enough to reveal a shape beneath the fog. There is the woman she shows to the world, composed, generous, understanding. And then there is the woman who waits, who worries, who withholds her own truth for fear of losing his interest. This is not a flaw. It is a survival instinct long rehearsed, the persona she built to feel safe, to feel wanted. Carl Jung called the persona the mask we wear to meet the demands of the world, not out of deceit, but necessity. And yet over time, the mask begins to take the shape of our identity. We forget it was ever a mask at all. In moments of distance, that mask tightens. She smiles when she feels unseen. She reassures when she wants to scream. She accepts less, hoping it will eventually become more. The conflict is quiet, but relentless. This is the struggle between who she is and who she believes she must be to stay loved. But beneath the mask, the shadow begins to rise. The shadow is not evil. It is not a darkness to be feared. It is everything we push aside in order to be accepted, the needs we silence, the truths we ignore, the anger we swallow. It is the part of her that wants to say, "This hurts." The part that wants to set a boundary. The part that doesn't want to be polite when her heart feels neglected. Yet instead, she plays the role. The cool, unbothered, low-maintenance woman. The one who doesn't ask for much. The one who always understands. This is not peace. This is performance. And the cost is heavy, not just emotionally, but spiritually. Each time she denies what she truly feels to protect the illusion of closeness, she fractures herself further. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And perhaps that is the deeper fear, not that he will leave, but that she will have to face the parts of herself she has long avoided. The parts that feel needy, the parts that feel too much, the parts she was taught would drive others away. But the truth is this: the woman who suppresses her fullness to keep another's attention is not loved, she is tolerated. And a life of toleration is not a life of truth. So, the internal split continues. She scrolls through his page, wondering if he sees her absence. She crafts a message in her mind, but never sends it. She reacts to his silence with silence of her own, but not from power, from pain. This is where confusion sets in. Is she detached or just disconnected? Is she strong or simply numb? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because unless the mask is removed, the shadow will always find a way to make itself known. Sometimes in anxiety, sometimes in resentment, sometimes in the quiet ache of self-abandonment. And still, the persona holds on because it has worked before. It has earned smiles, kept peace-bought time. But now, it begins to crack. She no longer wants to smile when she feels small. She no longer wants to ask for nothing just to remain in someone's orbit. She no longer wants to be admired for being easy to leave. And that desire, quiet, steady, new, is the beginning of awakening. But before she reaches it, she must sit with the discomfort of contradiction. To recognize how often she betrayed herself in the name of love, how often she confused being chosen with being valued. This is not blame, it is awareness. Because the woman who cannot see her own patterns will keep calling them fate. She will call silent strength. She will call neglect mystery. She will call herself patient when she is simply afraid to speak. But the deeper truth is this: no mask can hide a woman's true energy. It always leaks through in her eyes, in her voice, in the way her body tenses when she says she's fine. He may not see it, but she feels it. And feeling it is the beginning of change. The persona cannot survive where truth is welcome. And once she begins to welcome truth even softly, the mask begins to fall away. This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of remembrance. She is not here to be predictable. She is not here to beg for scraps. She is not here to win back the attention of someone who cannot see her. She is here to become whole, and wholeness requires the return of all parts, even the parts she thought she had to silence to be loved. Jung believed that healing is not becoming something new. It is reclaiming what we were forced to forget. So she sits quietly, no longer blaming herself, no longer chasing him, no longer performing for acceptance. She is simply with herself now. And in that stillness, a whisper begins to rise, not from the mask, not from the wound, but from the self. And it says, "You were never too much. You were just too real for someone still hiding from his own shadow." That is where we leave her now, in the space between false peace and real alignment. The mask still nearby, but no longer needed. The shadow still stirring, but no longer feared. And the self beginning to emerge. Something changes the moment she stops asking how to win him back and begins asking what she's been giving away. Not just to him, but to anyone who once made her feel small, just to feel seen. It doesn't begin with a grand declaration. It begins in quiet spaces, the stillness of a morning when she doesn't check her phone, the moment she catches herself mid-apology and chooses instead to be silent, whole, and aware. This is the beginning of consciousness, not in theory, but in her body. Her breath slows, her shoulders drop. She notices how much of her energy has been used to manage someone else's discomfort, and how little has been used to nourish her own. Carl Jung taught that the first step toward individuation is to confront the parts of ourselves we've disowned. And for many women, this includes strength boundaries, clarity, the very qualities that may have once been called difficult or too much or unattractive. But what if those very traits were never flaws? What if they were her soul, trying to surface despite the mask? Awakening is not the end of pain, but it is the end of confusion. She no longer mistakes distance for mystery. She no longer assigns meaning to silence that was never hers to decode. Instead, she begins to see the pattern, how she gave more when she felt unseen, how she tried harder when someone pulled away, how she overcompensated in the hope that love would return if she just proved herself enough. But now, she sees that love built on performance is not love. It's a contract one she never agreed to sign. This is the threshold between persona and self, between the woman she was taught to be and the one who is now awakening. And it's here, in this delicate, powerful space, that clarity begins to grow. She no longer asks, "Why doesn't he choose me?" Instead, she asks, "Why did I ever forget that I had the power to choose?" Jung said that until we bring the unconscious into consciousness, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. And this is how fate begins to loosen, not by changing the man, but by reclaiming the story. She doesn't need to make a dramatic exit. She doesn't need to punish him, or explain herself, or prove her value in one last message. That would still be reacting from the wound. Awakening means stepping back from the game entirely, because once she sees the dynamic clearly, she no longer wishes to participate in it. She no longer wants to be in relationships that require her to disappear in order to be loved. She no longer offers presence to someone who treats her absence as insignificant. And here, the energy shifts. Without sending a signal, she becomes the signal, not through force, but through embodiment, through living in alignment with the quiet knowing that she is already whole. Jung often spoke of symbols as the language of the unconscious. And if you were to imagine this moment as a symbol, it might be a closed door, and her hand finally releasing the handle. Not in anger, not in fear, but in release. Not everything that fades away is a loss. Some things must fall silent so we can hear our own voice again. And once she hears, it truly hears it, she realizes that the power she thought he held over her was power she had placed in his hands long ago. Now, she calls it back. This awakening doesn't need validation. It doesn't need applause. It grows in her eyes, in her walk, in the way she begins to prioritize peace over potential. Because potential is not enough. She has poured energy into men's potential her entire life. The hope that if she stayed patient, stayed beautiful, stayed agreeable, they would rise to meet her. But awakening means this: she no longer invests in someone's maybe. She invests in her now. She tends to her garden. She lets go of the branches that do not bloom. She surrounds herself with people who reflect truth, not performance. She doesn't do this to be chased. She does this so she never has to chase again. This is the moment the shadow becomes an ally, where before It whispered fears. You're too much. You'll end up alone. You'll never find better. Now it becomes the voice of truth. The part of her that says, you were never meant to live half lit. And it is this voice that leads her forward, not louder, but clearer, not faster, but fuller. Awakening is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who she was before she was told who to be. Before the conditioning. Before the longing. Before the silence taught her to lower her standards just to stay connected. Now, connection begins within. The need to be understood fades. What matters now is being true, even if misunderstood. And that is freedom. Because the man who ignores her is no longer a mystery to solve. He is a mirror that once reflected her doubt. And now that she sees clearly, she no longer needs that mirror. She's moved beyond the reflection, into embodiment, into life as it is, into love that begins with self, into relationships that feel like calm, not chaos. This is the awakening. It will not always be easy, but it will always be honest. And honesty with oneself, with one's patterns, with one's pain, is the light that dissolves illusion. She is no longer reacting. She is responding to what is. And what is the start of something true. The shift, when it comes, is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not need to be explained or justified. She simply no longer chooses what once chose her pain. After all the reflection, all the waking up, there comes a quiet moment of action, not to prove her worth, but to protect it. The moment she chooses herself, not in theory, but in practice. And this is what changes everything. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole, not through perfection, but through integration. And here, that integration begins to take shape. The part of her that once stayed silent now speaks with clarity. The part that once reached out now withdraws with dignity. The part that once confused endurance with loyalty now honors her limits. This is what a boundary truly is. It is not a wall built from fear. It is a threshold built from knowing. She no longer asks, how can I get him to care? She asks, how do I wish to be treated? And am I upholding that standard for myself? The man who once ignored her may not even notice the change at first, because it's not reactive. It's not meant to provoke or punish. It is simply the truth, finally given space to lead. She no longer texts to reestablish connection. She no longer crafts responses to seem agreeable. She no longer hovers near the phone wondering if today he will remember her worth, because now she remembers it. And in that remembering, she reclaims something far more valuable than his attention, her time, her energy, her peace. For so long, her energy flowed outward, toward him, toward the longing, toward the hope that if she just said the right thing, softened the right edge, gave enough space, or showed enough grace, he would see her. But now, that current reverses. She begins pouring that same energy inward, into her mornings, into her friendships, into the art of simply being whole. The phone grows quiet, but inside, She begins to hum again. And here is the great paradox. What once felt like abandonment now feels like relief. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. The space he left becomes space she can now fill. Not with more chasing, not with substitutes, but with depth. Because she is no longer available for dynamics that ask her to shrink. She is no longer flattered by attention that comes without effort. She no longer accepts presence without participation. These are not demands. These are standards. There is a difference between begging to be seen and requiring mutuality. One erodes the soul, the other protects it. And this is the turning point. She is no longer afraid to walk away from anything that makes her abandon herself. Jung reminded us that whatever we do not own within will show up outside often as conflict, repetition, or pain. And so she no longer waits for him to realize what she needed. She gives that realization to herself. She stops chasing closure from someone who never offered clarity. She no longer invests in potential that never turns into presence. She stops offering herself as a constant to someone who shows up like a question. These are not punishments. These are patterns. Ending. The boundary is not just a line she sets with him. It is a line she sets with her own history. With the part of her that once tolerated too much just to feel a little less alone. And as this transformation unfolds, she becomes less reactive and more rooted, less hopeful for change, more honest about reality, less impressed by words, more attuned to energy. What used to make her feel chosen now makes her feel exhausted. What used to excite her now feels empty. What used to keep her waiting now feels like wasted time. And that clarity is the gift of the boundary. Not every man will meet her standard, but that is no longer her concern. She is not here to convince someone to treat her well. She is here to live in alignment with the truth of who she is. The truth that says, I do not have to be easy to keep in order to be worthy of staying for. I do not have to perform softness in the face of disregard. I do not have to accept inconsistency just to avoid being alone. She reclaims solitude not as punishment, but as sanctuary. She reclaims her voice not to shout, but to stop whispering. She reclaims her future not through force, but by releasing what no longer fits her becoming. And yes, he may return. They often do. He may notice the absence of her energy, the quiet withdrawal of her attention, the shift from always there to no longer reachable. But the boundary is not meant to teach him a lesson. It is meant to honor the lesson she has finally learned. That anything requiring her to abandon herself to keep it was never love. That real connection does not begin with proving. It begins with recognition, mutual, steady, and clear. And if he cannot offer that, she no longer remains in the hope that he will. She no longer stays in places where she must explain her worth. She no longer feels guilty for not making herself small enough to be kept. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And so, she draws the line, not with cruelty, not with anger, but with peace. Because she knows now her peace is worth protecting. Her truth is worth honoring. Her energy is not owed to anyone who cannot meet her with respect. This is not the end of love. It is the beginning of self-trust. And trust, when rooted in the self, is the first real foundation of any relationship worth building. And now she no longer waits. Not because she gave up, but because she woke up. She no longer checks the messages that never came. She no longer rehearses the words she might have said. The questions have quieted. The ache has softened. And in its place, a deeper presence has arrived. There is no need to prove anything now. Not to him, not to the world, not even to herself. Because the journey wasn't about getting someone to see her. It was about remembering how to see herself. This is the true ending, not a dramatic farewell, but a gentle return. Carl Jung taught that wholeness comes not from what we gain, but from what we reclaim. And here she has reclaimed the part of herself that once begged for crumbs, mistaking them for connection. She sees now she was never truly seeking him. She was seeking peace, security, reflection. And he unknowingly became a mirror for her disconnection. His silence was not just an absence. It was a message. One that said, this is what happens when you place your worth in someone else's hands. But she no longer does that. She no longer sees silence as a puzzle to solve. She sees it as space, a space to grow, to breathe, to reorient. And from that space, she rises. Not as a version shaped by longing, but as a woman shaped by truth. The truth that her presence was never the problem. The truth that she was never too much, only too real, for someone still hiding from their own depth. She does not resent him. She no longer needs to. Because now she sees that his indifference wasn't power. It was fear. A fear of intimacy. A fear of reflection. A fear of what she might awaken in him. And this is the paradox. The moment she stopped chasing was the moment he felt her absence most. But that is no longer her concern. She does not draw boundaries to be missed. She does not reclaim her life to inspire regret. She does not heal to teach someone a lesson. She heals because it is time. Time to stop waiting for someone else to choose her. Time to stop dimming her light in exchange for temporary warmth. Time to stop hoping that emotional breadcrumbs will ever feel like a meal. And instead, time to root, to rise, to remember. Because when a woman stops needing to be chosen, she becomes magnetic in a different way. She becomes a presence, not a pursuit. A center, not a strategy. A mirror, but one that reflects only what is whole. Jung reminded us that everything unresolved will return again and again until we choose differently. And now she chooses differently. No more over-explaining. No more shrinking to stay palatable. No more internal debates about whether her standards are too high. She understands now that her boundaries are not punishments. They are expressions of love. Love for her time, her energy, her soul. And perhaps most important of all, she no longer mistakes loneliness for lack. She knows that solitude is not a void to fill with noise. It is a sanctuary where the self can finally be heard. This is not a story of victory over someone else. It is a story of victory over the voice that once said she was not enough. She sees now how many years she spent trying to be easy to keep, and how costly that was, how often she erased herself just to be acceptable. But that version of her no longer exists. She has integrated what was once fragmented. She has welcomed the shadow, released the mask, and return to the stillness that always waited within her. And in that stillness, she whispers a new vow: never again will I beg for what must be given freely. Never again will I chase what walks away. Never again will I confuse being chosen with being cherished. This is what individuation looks like in the soul of a woman. Not perfection, not performance, but alignment. And it is from this place, calm, clear-rooted, that she begins again. She loves differently now. She listens for energy, not just words. She notices where she feels safe to be all of herself, and she stays there. And when she does not feel safe, she leaves without needing to explain. Because her absence is not a game, it is a boundary, and her presence is not an offering, it is a gift. So if you've walked this path, if you've ever felt the pull to prove your worth, to overextend, to wait for love that hesitated, let this be your sign. You don't need to wait anymore. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You don't need to be chosen to feel valuable. You are already enough and have been all along. And once you feel that in your bones, you will never again settle for love that requires you to abandon yourself. Because at the end of it all, the most powerful realization is not that he lost you. It's that you came home to yourself. And in that home, you are safe, you are whole, and you are free. If this reflection touched something in you, let me know in the comments or share where you are listening from tonight. Sometimes, just by saying, I see it now, you give someone else permission to see it too. And remember, healing does not ask for perfection. It only asks that you stop betraying your soul for the sake of being seen. You are not here to be tolerated. You are here to be loved fully, honestly, and without conditions. And the moment you believe that is the moment everything changes.